I'm never gonna hear my nieces say, "Gunkle, can I get a nana? Gunkle, you going to work? Gunkle, are you okay?" I'm never gonna hear that again.
I really don't know where the inner strength comes from, but it's there. And I have a lot of people depending on me. So I cannot break down and I cannot be emotional at this time. This is a time to be strong. This is a time to support my cousins.
I don't know how to feel. I don't know how to act because I've lost 8 parts of me.
There is a question that has been sitting at the center of this story since the moment the news broke. Not the question of what happened. We know what happened. Not the question of who was responsible. That answer came before the sun had fully risen over Shreveport on April 19th, 2026. The question that nobody seems able to stop asking, the one that follows every headline and every prayer vigil and every tearful press conference, is the one that may never have a clean answer. Why? Why does a man who posts about church on Easter Sunday become someone who destroys the very family he was photographing just weeks earlier? Why does a father, a man who by all outward appearances was present, engaged, and proud of his children, make a series of choices in a single morning that cannot be undone? Why? When the signs were visible, when the words were posted publicly, when at least one phone call had been made in tears on a Sunday night, did nothing stop what was coming? That is what this video is about. Not just the timeline of what happened, not just the criminal record, the court date, the carjacking, the police pursuit. Those facts have been covered. What we have not fully examined is the internal landscape of Shamar Elkins, the pressures, the patterns, the psychological fractures that were quietly accumulating long before that Sunday morning, and what they tell us about how a human being arrives at a place that most of us cannot even bring ourselves to imagine. Because if we want to prevent the next one, we have to be willing to look at this one, honestly, carefully, without flinching. To understand what may have driven Shamar Elkins to that point, you have to understand what his life looked like from the inside. Not the version he was posting on social media, but the version that was quietly collapsing underneath it. Elkins was 31 years old. He had spent 7 years in the Louisiana Army National Guard, enlisting at around 18. The age when most young men from high-pressure environments are still figuring out who they are. The military gave him something that civilian life rarely offers at cleanly: structure, identity, purpose, a defined role within a defined system. You know where you stand. You know what is expected. You know who you are in relation to everyone around you. And then in August of 2020, that ended. He left the Guard at the rank of private. No deployment. No distinguished record. No clear next chapter. Just a return to Shreveport and the open-ended uncertainty of a life that no longer came with manual. This transition from a rigid framework of military service back into civilian life is one of the most psychologically vulnerable periods a veteran can navigate. And the research on this is not subtle. Men who struggle to rebuild identity after leaving service, particularly those who leave without a strong sense of accomplishment or closure, are at significantly elevated risk for depression, emotional dysregulation, and in the most severe cases, violence. Not because military service causes those outcomes, but because the loss of structure without adequate support to replace it can leave a person unmoored in ways that are not always visible from the outside. For Elkins, the years that followed his discharge were spent building what looked, from a distance, like a life, a marriage, a family, a social media presence filled with the kind of moments that communicate stability and love to everyone watching. But underneath that image, something else was taking shape. A man who had once defined himself through service was now defining himself almost entirely through one thing: his role as a father and a husband. And that foundation was beginning to crack. By early 2026, the marriage between Shamar Elkins and his wife, Shaniqua, was deteriorating. What had once been the central pillar of his post-military identity was now actively coming apart. Court proceedings had been initiated. A formal separation was underway. And a hearing was scheduled for Monday, April 20th, the morning after everything unfolded. That would have made all of it official, legal, and permanent. For most people, a divorce is one of the most painful experiences a human being can go through. The research on this is consistent and well documented. The period surrounding separation is statistically one of the most dangerous windows in any domestic relationship. Not because separation is wrong, but because for certain individuals, particularly those who have built their entire sense of self around the role of partner and parent, the loss of that relationship does not feel like a life change. It feels like an erasure, like the thing that made them who they are is being legally dismantled, one court filing at a time. And for Shamar Elkins, that pressure did not exist in isolation. It stacked on top of the identity void left by his military exit, on top of a criminal history that had already demonstrated a willingness to reach for a weapon when he felt cornered or threatened, on top of a mental health situation that, according to people closest to him, had been deteriorating for weeks before that Sunday. His own mother and stepfather have spoken publicly about a phone call they received from him on Easter Sunday, just days before the shooting. He was in tears. He told them he was being overwhelmed by what he described as dark thoughts. He said he wanted to take his own life. His stepfather told him he could push through it, that people overcome their struggles, that he could beat whatever he was facing. And Elkins responded with words that, in hindsight, carry a weight that is almost unbearable. He said, "Some people don't come back from their demons. That phone call happened. It was real. It was documented. And it is one of the clearest examples in this entire story of a moment where intervention was not just possible. It was right there, a man in crisis, reaching out, using language that any mental health professional would immediately recognize as a serious warning. And yet, no welfare check followed. No emergency response was initiated. No system was triggered. Just a father and a stepson on the phone. One of them tried to offer encouragement, and the other already moving towards something that encouragement alone could not reach. What makes this particularly difficult to sit with is the pattern it reveals, because the Easter Sunday phone call was not the only signal. On April 9th, 10 days before the shooting, Elkins posted publicly on social media, asking for help guarding his mind and his emotions. The language was framed as spiritual, as a prayer, the kind of post that reads as faith on the surface. But taken in the context of everything that was happening in his personal life at that moment, it reads as something more urgent, a man who was aware, on some level, that what was happening inside him was becoming harder to manage. Then came the repost. A viral social media prompt asking fathers whether they would go back and choose a different partner while keeping the same children. Most fathers engage with that kind of question to celebrate their families. Elkins answered differently. Publicly, unambiguously, he expressed that he would go back, that he would undo the circumstances that had created his family, that the life he had built was not the life he would have chosen. That post was visible to everyone connected to him. And what it communicated, a man expressing deep resentment toward his own life during an active marital collapse, weeks before a court date, passed without a single documented intervention. The signals were not hidden. They were not subtle. They were sitting in plain sight, in public, indexed and searchable. And still, nothing moved. We have to be careful here, because what we are about to walk through is not an attempt to excuse what Shamar Elkins did. There is no framework, no psychological theory, no combination of circumstances that makes what happened on April 19th acceptable or forgivable. 8 children lost their lives. 2 women were seriously injured. A community was shattered in the span of a single morning hour. Nothing in this section changes any of that. What this is an attempt to understand, because understanding is the only tool we have that might someday help prevent something like this from happening again. When Elkins left the military in 2020, he lost the structure that had defined him for 7 of his most formative years. He never replaced it with anything stable. No career that gave him purpose. No community that gave him belonging. By 2026, his entire identity had collapsed into one thing, being a husband and father. And when that was being legally dissolved, there was nothing underneath it to catch him. A man with no foundation outside of the role. He is a man in freefall. And freefall, without intervention, does not always end gently. Monday, April 20th, was not just a date on a calendar. For Elkins, it represented the moment everything became irreversible. Custody arrangements, financial separation, the formal, legal acknowledgement that the life he had built was over. Research on domestic violence escalation is clear on this. The period immediately surrounding legal separation is when risk spikes to its highest point. The court date did not cause what happened, but for a man already standing at the edge, it may have functioned as a deadline, a door closing permanently. And some people, rather than walking through that door, choose to destroy it entirely. The Easter Sunday phone call alone should have triggered intervention. A man in tears, expressing a desire to end his own life, telling his family that some people do not come back from their demons. That is not a metaphor. That is a person communicating a genuine crisis in the clearest language available to him. Had that call been followed by a welfare check, by an emergency mental health response, by any form of professional engagement, the trajectory of that week may have been different. It was not, and the cost of that gap was catastrophic. In 2019, Elkins discharged a firearm in proximity to a location where children were present. He entered a guilty plea and received probation. No prison time, no meaningful intervention. What that outcome communicated to him, whether consciously or not, was that the system would absorb his worst behavior without real consequence. When a person repeatedly tests a boundary and repeatedly finds it softer than expected, that boundary loses its power. The 2019 conviction was an opportunity. It was not treated like one. His own words, posted publicly, expressed a desire to undo his circumstances. That level of resentment directed at the relationship, at the life, at the choices that had led him to that point, is not a passing frustration. It is a sustained, simmering rejection of everything around him. And when the thing you resent is also the thing that is being taken from you legally, the emotional volatility of that combination is extraordinarily dangerous. There is no evidence that Elkins had access to meaningful mental health support, counseling, or any professional resource during the weeks leading up to April 19th. He had a stepfather who tried to encourage him over the phone. He had social media as an outlet, but encouragement and posting are not treatment. They are not intervention. A man in that level of psychological distress, without professional support, is navigating a collapsing internal world entirely alone. And that isolation has consequences. Perhaps the most difficult possibility to sit with is this one. By the time that Sunday morning arrived, Elkins may have already determined that he was not going to survive the day. The pursuit of his own death at the hands of law enforcement, what researchers refer to as suicide by confrontation, may have been the endpoint he had already chosen. And in the twisted, catastrophic logic of a mind in that state, taking his children with him may have felt like an act of possession rather than destruction. If he could not keep them, the thinking goes, then nobody could. That logic is not rational. It is not defensible, but it is documented. It has appeared in cases like this before. And understanding it, not accepting it, not forgiving it, but understanding it, is part of how we begin to build the kind of systems, resources, and community awareness that might one day reach the next Shamar Elkins before he reaches that point. Shreveport is still grieving. The families connected to those crime scenes are carrying something that does not have a timeline for healing. And the children who were lost that morning, whose names deserve to be spoken, whose lives deserve to continue, are gone in a way that no press conference, no policy discussion, and no YouTube video can adequately address. But silence does not serve them either. Neither does looking away. If this story left you with something, share it, talk about it, because the warning signs in this case were visible. And the conversation that did not happen before April 19th is the one we owe it to those children to have now. Like and subscribe for more cases covered with the depth and care they deserve. Thank you for watching.